You ever seen Robert Crumb's representations of bird-headed women?
No, I haven't.
Robert Crumb's an underground cartoonist, and he was the feature of a documentary which you and everybody else who's listening to this should definitely watch. It's the best documentary I've ever seen about anything ever. He draws these women. He was a loser in high school by his own admission, by every single category you could possibly generate. And so it's a study in loser psychology, but it's really complex because he was a loser who was extremely intelligent and unbelievably creative, and who had two brothers who were probably more intelligent, more creative than him, although also more psychopathological. And then he became successful. He was one of the establishers of underground cartooning back in the 1960s, and spawned arguably even graphic novel. I mean, he's a major player in that niche, and the documentary is a brilliant analysis of the relationship between failure and success, and sexual failure and sexual success. Because in one more memorable scene, he talks about, he drew this card when he was a high school kid of a heart being ripped apart when he got rejected by this girl or by all girls. He said he was beneath contempt. He wasn't even in the category of comprehensible dating partner. Right? He was outside the game entirely. So he's rejected by the feminine as such. He draws these pictures of bird-headed women with teeth, and they're powerful, big thighs, big rear end, like powerful, physically powerful, intimidating women, like mothers. Draws sometimes these characters of little tiny men climbing up the legs of these huge tree-like women, but they're very aggressive and domineering. And the reason for that, at least in part, is because every woman he ever approached was rejecting and aggressive in the extreme, treated him with nothing but contempt. And then he says in an unbelievably memorable piece of the documentary, that all changed when I got successful. And you can just hear the resentment and the bitterness in his voice, even though it did change. And he wasn't that old when he became successful. He was in his mid-20s. Plenty of time to be on the outs completely and to experience life at the bottom of the male dominance hierarchy and even farther down the female dominance hierarchy, let's say, in terms of desirable men. It's called Crumb, the documentary. I would highly recommend it. And it's absolutely brilliant study. And he had an authoritarian father and an indulgent mother, and she plays a key role in the documentary. And it's awful. It's awful. It's a study in Freudian psychopathology that's deep beyond belief. I've seen it like 40 times, showing it to my classes and walking through it clip by clip. But anyways, it's a study. You don't see the world from the perspective of down and out male loser. There are subcultures that sort of exist there, but this is the only examination of that place in the world I've ever seen that I thought really, really nailed it. The documentarist was a friend of the family, so and Charles' brothers, one of them ended up a sexual offender who lived on the streets of San Francisco, and the other committed suicide by drinking furniture polish when he was like 55, after being bullied terribly in high school and living in his mother's basement, essentially, for his entire life. Ugh, awful, awful. But, you watch the documentary, it's not like people really, you generate some compassion for the people in the documentary and what they've gone through. But I wouldn't say that compassion is what's primarily elicited by the documentary. And that goes back to this discussion we had right at the beginning about, what kind of empathy we have for the men who aren't making it. And the answer seems to be very, very little. Let's go to social policy with that. We might ask, okay, in light of this, what do we do? And I would say this is what I've recommended. I've recommended to young men that that these are the facts on the ground and they're not going to change. And that if you're being rejected chronically by women, or if you're terrified out of your mind about that, and perhaps rightly so, you should take a good hard look at yourself and see what it is that you have to offer. And so, are you as educated as you could be? Are you working? are you looking for a job at least? Are you trying to get out of your parents' house? Are you taking the steps necessary to become gainfully employed, productive, generous, and attractive? And, that tangles us back up with something we also talked about in the beginning, which is the criticisms that have been directed my way by men, which is, well, you're asking men to live up to a stereotype that essentially undermines and devalues the vast majority of them. You're part of the problem, not part of the solution. And your emphasis on responsible marriage, given the state of current family law, is nothing short of reprehensible. And so, my approach is do what you can at the individual level to put yourself in the game. But there's much more to the story than that.
Absolutely. This is really complex because the good news is there's a lot you can do to choose a woman who is the right woman. So, for example, looking at when you both go out to dinner, is she open to paying? If she isn't paying, does she cook a dinner for you the next time around? How does she treat the waiter? Somebody that can't do her any good. Ask her about her former relationships. How they broke up, and who was at fault. Is there any accountability and responsibility on her part? Of course, ask these same questions of yourself as well, especially about former relationships and how they broke up. And so that's so choosing the right woman is probably.
And so, what are you looking for there? You're looking for generosity. You're looking for kindness down the hierarchy, right? So that's how does she treat people who are social inferiors, so to speak, at least in that context, like waiters. And then with regards to previous relationships, is she capable of some self-analysis, or is it always the guy's fault? It reminds me of that Atlantic Monthly article, one of them. I unfortunately can't remember who wrote it, but it was this woman in her late 40s detailing out all the high-quality men that she had rejected, many, many, many men by her own account. And during the entire article, there wasn't any recognition whatsoever of any time when it might have been her. It was like, these 40 men didn't live up to my standards. It's like, well, after the fifth one, didn't you start thinking maybe the problem was on the other side of the dating table? But the answer was obviously no, and she was obviously still single. So what are you looking for there exactly? And why did you bring that up at that point?
Well, because one of the ways that you can be involved in the game of marriage in a way that is positive is by making the choice of the woman differently than what we tend to do. Many men look at a woman, she's beautiful, and our desire to be sexual with her leads us to sort of, okay, we'll pay for dinner, we'll promise this, we'll go here, we'll go there. And
yes, we should point out too, I just want to point out something. I talked to Randy Thornhill recently, one of the world's preeminent biologists. And before we get to thinking that this sexual attractiveness is nothing more than mere shallow-mindedness and impulsive gratification, is all the cues of sexual attractiveness are tightly associated with physical health and fecundity, which is the ability to procreate. And so even if men are blinded by beauty, which I do believe is true enough, their reasons for that at the deepest possible level still have to do with the desire to continue the human species. So it's shallow in one sense, but not in another. But your point is there are other markers that are characterological, that are more subtle, that need to be taken into account.
Yes, both sexes have very huge reproductive draws. I mean, from an insect right on up through human beings, women tend to procreate and have children with the alpha male. A good example of this is buck elks. And among buck elks, the females, 85% of them will have reproduced with the male that has the biggest rack. But what it takes to get that biggest rack is an exhaustion of 30% of the minerals, nutrients, and calcium in the buck elk. So the second that he reproduces, if he doesn't get rid of his rack immediately, he's likely to die before winter sets in, and he's able to replenish the nutrients and the minerals and so on. So his rack was very productive for being able to procreate. It was very productive for being able to attract the female, but it was also his weakness and that's very symbolic of men, that men's weakness is our facade of strength, because it was strength because we could use that rack, or not me, but the buck elks could use that rack to get rid of other predators or people that the female didn't want, to protect the female when she was creating the child, and so on. But he was also being used for being part of the next generation's benefit of producing the next generation's machine. And as you said, once we have children, we really live for the next generation. And so now then the next question becomes, as humans, do we want to create more options for ourselves? And are we at a point now where survival is mastered enough in the middle and upper middle class that we have then we are chosen merely for our success? And I think the best explanation of that comes in Japan, where the millennials in Japan have a game called karoshi. And of course, karoshi means death at the desk or death from overwork. And the game, each person has a little karoshi figure, and they compete to get to the top of the ladder. It might be the political ladder, it might be the economic ladder, it might be the religious ladder. And as they compete to get to the top of the ladder, the one who gets to the top of the ladder first commits suicide. Not in real life, but in the game. And the point that the Japanese millennials are communicating with each other is that that what we did to become that successful man, who was the most attracted, who was the most able to be eligible for sex and for love, is we unbecame a human doing, climbing to the top of the ladder. We unbecame a human being. We didn't even think of ourselves as a human being. That's why we're committing suicide. We have just by competing to be at the top of the ladder, we've worried about what position we wanted, working more hours, pleasing the boss, pleasing the corporation, not selling something we wanted or doing something we wanted. And we never even considered ourselves as a human being. And so now we Japanese millennials are going to start looking at the loss of ourselves as human doings, the loss of ourselves rather as human beings. And that is, and that's in my opinion, where we need to consider going. That as we have children, there's this balancing act of helping our children see the value of being that artist, that painter, that's doing what you love to do, combined with, is it creating enough income to be responsible to your family to do that? And yes, it will lose you some women, but if you're developing emotional skills and emotional intelligence, that may not attract as many women as the football player that risks his life and spinal cord injury, but it may attract the type of woman you want.